Having fought the Ottoman army to a stalemate on October 25th, and with darkness falling, the Christian War Council unanimously agreed upon a plan for the following day. Hoping to replicate the actions of October 24th on a larger scale, they would once again allow the Ottomans to cross the stream. They knew that there would only be enough space for a small portion of the massive army to deploy for battle. The Christians planned to split their army into two battle groups. The first battle group would deploy with its back against the camp, and with the Kachi stream protecting its right flank. In doing so, they would draw the Ottoman army towards the Christian side of the stream, at first allowing several thousand to cross. They would then quickly surge forward and overwhelm these units, whose only avenue of retreat would have been back into their own troops, who would still be in the process of fording the stream. In the ensuing confusion, the task of the second battle group would be to flank around through the northern passage and strike the disorganized Ottoman formation from the side, simultaneously cutting off their retreat. The major encounter had finally come. Pivoting away for a moment, we can examine a historical representation of this battle, one which perfectly illustrates the strategies I've been describing. This painting, titled Battle of Keresztes 1596, is not only an example of the Ottoman artistic style at the time, but it also provides the opportunity to see some of the weapons and strategies that were used. It's a seminal piece of Ottoman history and a priceless cultural artifact. But what if you could put a price on it? Or better yet, what if you could use it to improve your financial future? Today's sponsor, Masterworks, knows just how incredible art can be as a financial asset. And the best part is, they give you access at a fraction of the cost most would have to pay. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you've probably heard us talk about Masterworks. In fact, the responses from our subscribers has been amazing, with hundreds of sign-ups and thousands of dollars invested in the art they offer, art from legends like Picasso, Warhol, and Banksy. That's hundreds of people using art to diversify their portfolios, hedge against inflation, and potentially get some nice-looking returns. Because to date, Masterworks has sold 3 of their paintings, with each returning over 30% net IRR to their members. But we have to add, past performance is no guarantee of future results. However, 30% in this economy is undeniably exceptional. If you want to join the other HistoryMarche subscribers already on the platform, they're offering all of you priority access to skip their waitlist. Click the link in the description to join the over 400,000 members already on Masterworks. Invest in blue chip art for the very first time by signing up for Masterworks. It is worth mentioning that during the final Allied War Council, the Archduke had suggested that the Christian army would likely have been able to defeat the Ottomans simply by keeping them occupied for a few more days, rather than seek a decisive engagement, believing that the Sultan's host would likely disintegrate on its own. The Austrian Archduke's assessment proved to be correct, as during the same night, the Ottoman leadership realized that they would have to seek a decisive engagement the following day, as their army was exhausted and running low on provisions. However, instead of allowing their troops to rest for the night, the Ottoman commanders instead agreed to attempt a night crossing. Utilizing the smaller fording points found by the Tatars further south, the army spent the entire night and early morning of October 25th and 26th, crossing in small groups and moving into position. Although the Christian army was surprised by the early Ottoman crossing, they were not necessarily caught unprepared. Upon seeing the Ottoman positions, the Allied command made a sudden change in their battle plans, deciding that the army would under no circumstances cross the stream to pursue the Ottomans, thereby eliminating the need for a second battle group. Under threat of encirclement by the Ottomans, the Christian forward units guarding the ford were quickly recalled and used instead to screen the Allied army as it deployed for battle. The Christian artillery once again proved its worth, as their volleys managed to halt the Ottoman advance altogether. The exact deployment of the Christian army is somewhat unclear and is still debated. An unknown number of cannons were placed on the flanks in front of the main battle line, with both batteries being assigned around 500 infantry each. It appears that the Western Christian infantry, under the command of Schwarzenberg, were divided into 5 tercios and placed in the center of the first line, with Hungarian and Transylvanian light infantry covering the center right and center left, respectively. Placed in between the tercios was a portion of the Transylvanian Hussars, commanded by Sigismund Bathory. The second line, deployed in a wedge formation, was designed to punch straight through the Ottoman ranks. Led by Archduke Maximilian III, it consisted of 4,000 Hungarian Hussars, led by Palffy, their flanks covered by heavy German cavalry, with 1,000 riders on the right and 1,300 on the left. At the back of the wedge were 500 of the most heavily armed and armored knights Europe had to offer. These riders, most of whom were from Westphalia, along with their horses, were covered head to toe in full plate armor. The third and final line was led by Tiefenbach and composed mostly of the remaining Hungarian cavalry and infantry, also including a number of mixed units from other allied nations as well. Around 10,000 troops stayed behind to guard the camp. The deployment of the Ottoman army is also unclear, although we do know that a crescent-shaped formation was adopted. It seems that 24,000 cavalry led by Ibrahim Pasha were placed in the center, with artillery batteries on either side placed in intervals, totaling 109 cannons. In between each interval was a unit of around 2,000 janissaries who stood in squares, as the narrow terrain prevented them from forming a proper battle line. The left and right flanks were occupied by the Anatolian and Rumelian armies respectively. In front of the flanks were the irregular cavalry units, with the Tatars on the front right wing. On the other side of the stream, facing northeast, stood the Sultan with the rest of his Janissary infantry, flanked by cavalry on either side and a few artillery pieces to their front. Additionally, a large contingent of cavalry had been sent to the northern passage, with orders to wait for an opportune moment and attempt to strike the Christian army from the rear. The battle eventually began, with the Christian first line pushing forward under the cover of artillery fire. The flanks of the first line charged ahead and engaged the Ottomans opposite them. However, the Christian right flank, who had enjoyed some initial success, pushed too far and found themselves pressed on two sides as a unit of Janissaries from the Sultan's contingent crossed the stream and joined the fight. Seeing this, Albert Karai, who was positioned on the left flank, renewed his attack, managing to rout the Tatar cavalry in front of him. However, rather than pushing their advantage, the contingent of Sikli guardsmen under his command took to looting the corpses of their enemies. This prompted the routing Tatar cavalry to turn back and charge the unsuspecting infantry. Some units of Tatars attempted to swing around the Christian flank and encircle the infantry in the first line. However, Tiefenbach managed to counter this movement with his own cavalry from the third battle line, eventually routing the Tatars. The Ottomans positioned at the northern passage now also commenced their attack, although were unable to break through the Christian defenses. With both its flanks in danger of being routed, the slow-moving tercios of the first line finally arrived. The Ottoman cavalry opposing them could do little to stop the wall of pikes as they edged forward slowly. Using these moving fortresses as cover, the Hungarian and Transylvanian horsemen of the first line launched lightning strikes against the Ottoman units. The Ottomans were seemingly helpless in the face of the highly trained European army, who, despite being outnumbered on the battlefield, utilized their local superiority to deadly effect. Whenever the Ottoman cavalry threatened to overwhelm the Christian riders, the Hussars would quickly withdraw back through the gaps and behind the protection of their infantry. If the Ottoman cavalry withdrew too far away from the tercios, the Christian artillery would target them, and if they came too close, they exposed themselves to both rifle fire and the sudden charges of the Christian cavalry. Unable to endure such abuse, the Ottoman cavalry under Ibrahim Pasha were eventually routed. The Christian center continued to push forward, defeating the remaining Janissary units and capturing all 109 of the Ottoman cannons. Sigismund Bathory then ordered his cavalry to aid the flanks, attacking the Ottomans from the side. Leading some cavalry from the third line, Tiefenbach also came to the aid of the Christian left flank. After some fighting, what remained of the Ottoman left flank were also eventually routed. The seemingly unstoppable Christian advance was finally halted by a unit of Janissaries who had taken up position at the fortified church. The Christian infantry repeatedly attempted to storm the Ottoman positions, but each time were repelled by the Janissaries. The Christians eventually realized that if they wished to dislodge the stubborn Ottomans from their fortifications, they would need more offensive power than the infantry could provide. The Christian second line was finally brought forward. Under the cover of artillery fire, the steel-clad wedge of men and horses drove forward and crashed into the Ottoman positions. Simultaneously, the Christian infantry had taken up position in the nearby ruined houses and now began indiscriminately firing into the Ottoman ranks. Even under the immense pressure of the combined arms of the Christian infantry, cavalry, and artillery, the Janissaries clung desperately to their final remaining bridgehead. It was only after a bloody melee that they were finally routed and forced back across the stream. Upon achieving this great success, however, the Christian commanders now faced a dilemma. Despite the Allied leaders having agreed earlier in the morning that under no circumstance would they cross the stream, the Hungarian and Transylvanian commanders now rode to the Archduke's position, calling on him to press the attack. Both Maximilian III and Schwarzenberg were hesitant to do so, not wanting to overextend the army. Sigismund Bathory, Albert Caray, and Count Palffy, all seemingly intoxicated with success, however, continued to pressure the Archduke, arguing that a complete and total victory was theirs for the taking. It was also around this time that the Archduke received an incorrect report that the Sultan had already abandoned his army. With this news, Maximilian III finally relented and agreed to chase the enemy across the stream. The initial Christian attempts to cross were met with stiff Ottoman resistance, the attacks of the German and Transylvanian infantrymen being repulsed multiple times. The Christian artillery was eventually brought forward, and under the cover of cannon and rifle fire, the army was finally able to force its way across. The Allied commanders attempted to reform the army into their previous three-line battle formation. However, this was an incredibly difficult task to accomplish, as not only would the line now have to be rotated a full 90 degrees, but there was also only enough room for two lines. Worst of all, the crossing had not been completed in any organized manner, with the troops of different units being hopelessly intermingled. The army would be exposed to attack as it organized itself, which evidently would take a significant amount of time that the Christians simply did not have. Ibrahim Pasha, having managed to rally a portion of his forces near the northeastern end of the Ottoman camp, saw that the Christian army was in disarray. The Grand Vizier hurriedly ordered his contingent to charge the assembling Christian lines. Lucky for the Christians, however, the Archduke had already managed to reform his cavalry wedge and quickly moved to intercept the incoming Ottoman charge. In the ensuing clash, the more heavily armed and armored European cavalry emerged victorious, the impact of their charge scattering the Ottoman cavalry in all directions. Ibrahim Pasha himself was pushed back to the very walls of the Ottoman camp. Meanwhile, it seems that the other Allied commanders either realized that it would be impossible to organize their troops in a reasonable amount of time, or that they lost control of the troops, who believed that the battle had already been won and were eager for a chance to plunder the Ottoman camp. As they approached the camp, the Christian units were still able to form some semblance of a battle line, albeit extremely disorganized. Their advance was met by around 4,000 Janissaries, who had fortified themselves along the eastern entrance of the Ottoman camp and were supported by 4 cannons. Heavily outnumbered, however, this unit was overwhelmed by the charge of the Christian first line of infantry. Unfortunately for the Christians, however, it was here where the front ranks of the Allied army finally lost any semblance of cohesion and discipline, as the army of Germans, Austrians, Hungarians, and Transylvanians devolved into a mob of looters, scattering amongst the tents in search of plunder, with many even discarding their weapons in their eagerness. A group of Christian cavalry also managed to force their way into the Ottoman camp from the north, and without facing any resistance, made their way to the Sultan's tent near the southern end of the Ottoman camp, where they encountered a unit of Janissaries who were still in good order. The Janissaries first discharged their rifles, then drew their swords and fell upon the shocked Christian riders, who began to flee. It was at this point that the supposedly victorious Christian army began to descend into a rout. In their haste to cross the stream and seize what they believed to be an easy victory, and in part due to the clouds of gunpowder smoke in the air which limited visibility, the Christian commanders had failed to recognize that a significant portion of the Ottoman army was still intact. In addition to the troops still fighting, there were still 10,000 unengaged Janissary infantry and a large number of Sipahi cavalry at the southern end of the Ottoman camp. Additionally, the Ottoman reserves and rear guard, along with other rallied units of Tatar and Anatolian cavalry numbering over 25,000, were also still positioned outside and to the south of the camp. Finally, the unit that had been sent to assault the northern passage earlier in the battle had also been recalled and were now within sight of the Ottoman camp. The Sultan, who had at first considered fleeing, was persuaded by one of his advisors to remain with the army and continue fighting. Mehmed III finally took charge, and under his leadership, the remaining fresh units of Janissaries and Sipahi cavalry launched a counterattack. The Sultan also called upon every able-bodied servant and camp follower to take up arms and aid his troops in driving out the Christians from the Ottoman camp. To all those that obeyed, he promised to grant the rank and salary of Sipahi. The now revitalized Ottoman forces quickly began overwhelming the scattered and sometimes unarmed Christian troops, who were in no position to put up any real resistance. Simultaneously, the Ottoman units outside the camp also commenced their attack from both the north and the south. It is worth mentioning that while these attacks occurred nearly at the same time, it appears that this was purely by chance and was not necessarily the result of any planning or coordination between the Ottoman commanders. As the fleeing Christian infantry began emerging from the Ottoman camp, they ran into their own horsemen, who up to this point were still in battle order and were engaged with the returning Ottoman units. The sight of the panicked infantry sowed confusion amongst the Allied cavalry units. As more and more panicked infantry began spilling out of the camp, the Christian riders became unnerved, and soon an unstoppable wave of hysteria swept over the entire Allied army. A few hundred Hussars suddenly broke formation and began to flee, then a few flags of German riders, and within moments, nearly the entire Christian army had routed. The Archduke, along with a bodyguard of 300 riders, attempted to stem the mass rout, only to be brushed aside by the sea of panic-stricken troops. Seeing that his efforts were futile, Maximilian III withdrew to the ford, and there again haplessly attempted to rally the army. The only resistance the Ottomans faced as they began running down the Christians was from the contingent of a German prince, Bernard of Anhalt, who unsuccessfully tried to stop the pursuing Ottoman cavalry with 200 Saxon knights. Maximilian III, who by now had accepted that the battle was lost, also attempted to cover the retreating army with the Christian artillery. However, after firing 2 volleys, the artillery crews also abandoned their positions. Many Allied troops were slaughtered by the Ottomans as they attempted to cross the narrow ford, some even drowning as they climbed over one another in desperation. A Transylvanian officer recounts that bodies were piled so high in some places along the stream that one could cross without ever having touched either mud or water. The only saving grace for the Christian army, however, was that the Ottomans, who were likely too exhausted to continue the pursuit, chased the Christian troops only to the edge of the stream. Even with this disastrous rout, modern historians believe that had there been any commander to do so, it would have been possible to rally and reorganize the Allied army within the protection of the fortified Christian camp. However, upon seeing the Allied troops looting their own camp, the Archduke dared not go inside and instead abandoned the battlefield. The only commander to actually have returned to the camp was Count Palfy. However, by the time he arrived at around midnight, the army had already all but disintegrated. Realizing this, the remaining Christian troops admitted defeat, silently gathered their belongings, and returned home. On the Ottoman side, the Sultan at first struggled to regain control of his scattered army, only managing to do so a day after the last of the Christian forces had withdrawn. However, as it was now late October, and with their logistical capacity already stretched to its limit, they were unable to take advantage of the victory. Large amounts of equipment and material was left behind on the battlefield, as the Ottomans were unable to take much with them as they returned home, the rest having been abandoned by the Christians in their haste. The Battle of Keresztes proved to be the Ottomans' last great victory in Central Europe. Having failed to achieve any significant change in the status quo of the region, it seems that the tens of thousands of casualties suffered on both sides were ultimately for nothing. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give us a like and don't forget to subscribe if you're new around here. Big thanks to our patrons for supporting our work. And as always, we'll see you in the next one.